They called her the First Lady of Laughter, a red-haired comet blazing through America's living rooms, a woman whose smile could silence storms and whose voice could heal a tired nation. Every Sunday night, as curtains parted and her theme song rose, the world leaned closer. That simple tug on her ear became a promise that for the next hour, pain would fade and laughter would stand in its place. But applause is a poor translator of pain. Behind the glow of studio lights lived a woman who knew what silence sounded like when no one was left to listen. Long before the laughter, before the fame, she had already learned how fragile love could be, how it slurred, stumbled, and forgot your name. Carol Burnett was the child of two dreamers who lost their way inside a bottle. Her father, once a projectionist who brought moving pictures to life, watched his own fade in the haze of gin. Her mother, an aspiring writer whose words drowned in whiskey, drifted through Carol's early years like a ghost in daylight. By the time she was old enough to understand heartbreak, she had already lived it. Years later, she would transform those wounds into art, but at the time, the only sound she could rely on was her own. The Tarzan yell that would one day echo across national television began as a child's defiance in a crumbling apartment, a scream against loneliness, against hunger, against the feeling that no one was coming. The world would one day see a star, a beacon of joy who made millions laugh until they cried. But the truth beneath the glitter is harder, quieter, and far more human. Carol Burnett's life is not the story of a woman who became funny. It's the story of a woman who refused to break, who turned neglect into grace, sorrow into timing, and heartbreak into the most enduring kind of hope. At 92, she stands as a living paradox, fragile and eternal, soft-spoken and unshakable, the very definition of resilience wrapped in laughter. Her life is not a punchline, it's a requiem for survival. If her show once taught a nation how to laugh until it cried, her life, the real, unedited, unscripted life, taught us something even harder: how to cry until we can laugh again. San Antonio, Texas, 1933. The Great Depression was more than an economic crisis. It was a mood that filled the air like dust. In a narrow apartment above a movie theater, a child named Carol Creighton Burnett came into a world already running out of light. Her father, Joseph Thomas Burnett, was a projectionist, a man who spent his nights surrounded by the glow of the silver screen, feeding the dreams of strangers while his own quietly dissolved. Her mother, Ina Louise, dreamed of being a writer, but reality offered her only empty bottles and unfinished pages. The laughter that would one day heal millions began in a house where laughter was scarce. Carol grew up in the echo of slammed doors, the smell of gin, and the soft rattle of loneliness. She once said, "When people ask where I learned timing, I tell them waiting for my parents to come home taught me everything about silence." When both parents finally succumbed to alcoholism, physically and emotionally, Carol found herself in the care of her maternal grandmother, Mabel Eudora White, a small woman with iron in her spine and faith stitched into her every gesture. Mabel was poor, but she had rules. And more importantly, she had love. In 1940, the two boarded a bus bound for Hollywood, chasing the illusion of new beginnings. But dreams there cost rent. Their world shrank to a single room in a faded boarding house on Northwestern Avenue, $20 a week for a bed, a hot plate, and the company of lost souls. Addicts, transient workers, forgotten actors, and the hopeless all passed through that hallway. It was noisy at night, but loneliness still found a way in. From that poverty, Carol crafted her first stage, the imagination. She invented an imaginary twin sister named Karen Bold, where Carol was shy, beautiful where she felt invisible, fearless where she was fragile. She played both parts perfectly, sneaking out the fire escape to change clothes and re-entering the building as someone new. Neighbors believed she had a sister. They didn't realize they were watching an audition for survival. Years later, she explained it simply: Karen was everything I wasn't. She was my rehearsal for the woman I hoped to become. That performance became a blueprint, a coping mechanism that shaped her craft. Psychologists might call it dissociation. She called it imagination. In a world where her parents were unpredictable, pretending was control, acting was safety. But even imaginary sisters get lonely. On Saturdays, Carol and Mabel would spend their only quarter on movie tickets, sitting in the dark, absorbing light. The screen became her sanctuary, a portal to somewhere clean and kind. She watched Betty Davis command a room, Judy Garland chase rainbows, and thought, maybe I belong somewhere like that. When the credits rolled, the magic ended abruptly. Hunger returned. Pride forbid begging. So they quietly stole toilet paper from the theater's restroom before walking home. Carol would later recall that moment, not with shame but clarity. It wasn't stealing. It was surviving. We took only what the world refused to give. One night, the theater played Tarzan the Ape Man. When Johnny Weissmuller's iconic yell filled the room, something inside her lit up. She mimicked it endlessly, not realizing she was strengthening her diaphragm, finding rhythm, discovering voice. That yell became her rebellion, a sound that said, "I exist." Years later, when she'd recreate that same sound on national television, millions would laugh. None of them would know it was once the cry of a child proving she was still alive. By the time Carol reached her teens, she wasn't dreaming of fame. She wanted stability, structure, perhaps even journalism, to make sense of chaos through words. Her plan was simple: graduate, study, survive. But survival alone rarely satisfies destiny. Because one day, a stranger's kindness, a crisp $50 bill, slipped into her palm by a man whose name she never learned, would change everything. It wasn't charity, it was belief. And for a girl who had known only conditional love, belief was the rarest gift of all. That single act didn't just pay tuition at UCLA, it paid for possibility. And in the lecture halls of Los Angeles, a shy girl who'd spent her childhood whispering to an imaginary twin was about to find her real voice, a voice that would one day make the entire world listen. Hollywood in the 1940 seconds was not the city of angels. It was a mirage. Beneath its neon shimmer, the streets whispered stories of ambition, poverty, and people who smiled with hunger in their teeth. Carol and her grandmother Mabel became two of those invisible souls, tucked inside a boarding house full of broken dreams. Their world was one narrow room, a single iron bed, a cracked mirror, a window that looked out not on palm trees, but on a dirty alley lined with rusted trash cans. Still, to Carol, it was a palace, because Mabel was there. She called her nanny, and in a lifetime filled with instability, that word became the only home that never crumbled. When Mabel worked nights sewing or scrubbing, Carol would rehearse voices in the dark fragments of movie lines, whispers of characters she had seen at the cinema. Sometimes, she would hold her hairbrush like a microphone and mimic the actresses she admired. Her reflection, an audience of one. Family perspective. "We didn't have anything," Carol later said, "but she gave me something nobody else did: consistency. I could count on her being there, and that meant more than money." Yet, love could not shield her from humiliation. Children at school teased her for her hand-me-down clothes, her plain shoes, her quiet voice. Teachers noticed her intelligence but dismissed her shyness as weakness. What they didn't see was that every night, behind that fragile silence, Carol built worlds to escape into little performances that helped her survive another day. It was around this time she created her twin, Karen, a bright, fearless alter ego who spoke the lines Carol couldn't. She would sneak out the window, dressed in one outfit, then re-enter minutes later in another, pretending to be her own twin sister. Neighbors believed it. Some even greeted Karen separately, not realizing that they were greeting the same lonely child twice. Psychologists later described this as an early form of identity splitting, a survival instinct born from emotional deprivation. But for Carol, it was simpler than that. "I didn't think I was pretending," she once said softly. "I was practicing." Theater, for her, didn't begin on a stage. It began in the cracks of a child's heart, where imagination filled the spaces love left empty. Saturdays were holy. She and Mabel saved their only quarter to sit in the back row of a movie theater, where flickering light felt like grace. There, amid the glow of the screen, Carol found what she called a different kind of family. The stars spoke a language she understood: yearning, courage, survival disguised as art. When the credits rolled, reality waited outside. But for those 2 hours, she wasn't poor or forgotten. She was seen. They would walk home in silence, pockets lighter, hearts heavier. Mabel would stop Carol before they climbed the stairs to their building and whisper, "Someday, sweetheart, you'll be up there too. You just don't know it yet." Sometimes, when hope ran out, they would borrow toilet paper from the theater's restroom. It sounds pitiful, but in their world, dignity was measured by how quietly you endured. Carol never complained. She was learning something far more valuable: the rhythm of resilience. Then one night, destiny called in the strangest voice imaginable. Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan yell. It echoed through the theater with wild abandon, something primal and absurd. Carol couldn't stop mimicking it. Over and over, she practiced until her lungs burned and her throat ached. She didn't know it then, but she was shaping her future, strengthening the same muscles that would later project her voice across theaters and television screens. That Tarzan yell, once a child's rebellion, became her signature, her weapon against despair. Years later, she laughed about it, saying, "It was the first time I ever felt powerful. That yell gave me permission to exist." By high school, Carol was still painfully shy, but teachers began noticing her storytelling ability. Her essays were vivid, cinematic, full of empathy. She dreamed of becoming a journalist to write truth, not perform fiction. Maybe, she thought, words on a page would be safer than words on a stage. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When she applied to UCLA, her acceptance letter came with a single obstacle: a $50 registration fee. It might as well have been $5,000. She didn't cry. She just folded the dream neatly and tucked it away. Then, as if conjured by fate, a stranger approached. No name, no reason, only a $50 bill and a quiet sentence: "Use it for your future." She never saw him again. But that moment cracked her world open. "He believed in me before I did," Carol said years later. And that changed everything. That belief carried her to the doors of UCLA, a place that felt like another planet. She walked onto campus in secondhand shoes, clutching borrowed books, surrounded by children of privilege. Her goal was simple: study journalism, stay invisible. But destiny doesn't hide. It waits. One semester later, a mandatory drama class would alter her entire life, and the quiet girl who once whispered to an imaginary twin would finally discover that her real voice belonged on stage. The stage found her by accident. At UCLA, Carol Burnett enrolled in a mandatory drama class she never wanted to take. She was supposed to write about other people's stories, not perform her own. But the moment she stepped under the faint yellow glow of stage light, something ancient and electric awoke inside her. She wasn't acting, she was remembering. Every silence from childhood, every scream she'd buried in that Tarzan yell, every empty room she'd survived, suddenly became material. The audience laughed, and for the first time, she felt the warmth of belonging. Professor's recollection, archival interview. She had timing you couldn't teach. Her face could tell a joke before her mouth ever opened. Carol switched majors that semester from journalism to theater, a terrifying decision for a girl with no safety net. She began performing in small campus productions, late-night sketches, and student revues, walking home under the glow of street lamps, too poor for taxis but too alive to care. By the end of her first year, she was voted most promising newcomer in UCLA's theater department. That small recognition meant more to her than applause ever could. It was proof that all those nights spent pretending to be Karen had not been madness. They had been rehearsal. But destiny was not done with her yet. One night in 1954, while attending a party filled with half-dreamers and full-time waiters, Carol found herself wrapping leftover hors d'oeuvres for her grandmother. She was shy, polite, almost invisible until a well-dressed stranger approached her. He was older, confident, with the calm air of someone used to changing lives. He asked her what she wanted. Without hesitation, she said, "To go to New York to work in theater." He asked how much it would take. $2,000, she said, half joking. The man nodded and said he would send her the money with 3 conditions. She must never reveal his name. She must use it only for her career. And if she succeeded, she must pass it on. She kept all 3 promises. A few weeks later, Carol and her then-boyfriend Don Soroyan boarded a train to New York City with exactly $2,000 in their pockets and everything they owned in 2 suitcases. They had no job, no plan, no idea how impossible their dream really was. New York, in the 1,950 seconds, was merciless to dreamers. The snow was gray with soot, and rent was a predator. They found a home at the rehearsal club, a haven for struggling female performers. 4 girls to a room, 1 bathroom, endless auditions. Carol worked nights as a hat check girl, stuffing tips into an envelope she labeled "Nanny's Money." Days were for auditions, rejection, and rehearsal. Yet, she never lost that spark. Roommate's memory. She was the quiet one, but when she laughed, the whole hallway heard it. We all knew she was going somewhere. Then, one evening, during a small cabaret performance, Carol was handed a silly, almost throwaway number, a mock love ballad about John Foster Dulles, the stoic Secretary of State. The other girls rolled their eyes. But Carol sang it with such earnest melodrama that the audience erupted in laughter. It wasn't just funny, it was alive. That performance changed everything. Sitting in the audience that night was a talent scout from the Jack Parr Show, who immediately booked her. When she performed the same number on national television, she didn't just make people laugh, she made them feel seen. Producers noticed. Viewers wrote letters. By January 1957, Carol was standing on the Ed Sullivan Show, her voice trembling but sure. The bright studio lights didn't frighten her anymore. They felt like destiny calling her home. I was terrified, she recalled. But the second I opened my mouth, I felt like I belonged. The response was explosive. Sullivan invited her back that August. By then, she was earning enough to support herself and to repay her mysterious benefactor. On the 22nd of June, 1959, exactly 5 years to the day after his gift, she sent him a $2,000 check. No note, no return address. He never replied. But Carol didn't need him to. She had already paid him back in the only currency that mattered, faith fulfilled. That same year, she auditioned for Once Upon a Mattress, an off-Broadway musical that needed someone unpolished, raw, and a little reckless. She landed the lead role, Princess Winifred, the Woebegone, a muddy, loud, utterly unrefined girl who shattered every fairy tale stereotype. Audiences roared. Critics praised her unpretentious brilliance. Broadway transferred the show within months. Her name lit up the marquee for the first time. The New York Times called her a revelation of comedic honesty. Time magazine called her a one-woman riot. But Carol didn't measure success in reviews. Her triumph was quieter. She finally felt seen without pretending to be anyone else. When her first Tony nomination arrived that year, she sat alone in her tiny apartment, holding the letter, thinking of Mabel's trembling hands and the lines she'd whispered long ago. Someday, sweetheart, you'll be up there too. She was. And this time, she didn't have to imagine her twin cheering in the crowd because the world was already doing it for her. It began not with fireworks, but with persistence. By the early 1960 seconds, Carol Burnett had become a familiar face on American television, not yet a household name, but a woman whose presence lingered after the credits rolled. Her recurring appearances on The Gary Moore Show shaped her like an artist chiseling marble. Every sketch was a lesson, every laugh a risk. Gary Moore, her mentor, once said, "Carol wasn't chasing jokes, she was chasing truth." That's why her comedy stuck to the heart. On set, she became the show's secret heartbeat, the one who stayed after hours, rewatching tapes, studying audience reactions, learning the delicate rhythm between timing and tenderness. While others performed to be adored, Carol performed to connect. Her charwoman character, the hunchback cleaning lady with a feather duster and infinite hope, became her mirror. Audiences saw humor, but she saw reflection. A woman who kept sweeping through life's mess, smiling anyway. Those moments on Moore's show built the foundation for something larger than anyone could have predicted. When CBS offered her a development deal in 1967, they expected her to follow the safe formula: a sitcom, a husband, a laugh track. But Carol remembered the promise she made to herself as a child staring up at the movie screen: never live someone else's story. She invoked a clause in her contract that CBS executives had long forgotten, one that granted her the right to create a variety show if she wished. They resisted. "Sketch comedy is for men," they told her. "Women can't carry a full hour of humor." She smiled, the kind of smile that precedes history, and said, "Then let me prove it." On the 11th of September 1967, The Carol Burnett Show aired for the first time. What followed was a revolution draped in sequins and sincerity. Each week, Carol opened the show by facing her live studio audience directly, no teleprompter, no character, just Carol. She sang, "I'm so glad we had this time together," and waved, tugging her ear, a silent hello to her grandmother Mabel, who had passed away years earlier. Millions of families sang along. That small gesture turned into one of television's most intimate rituals, a nation's weekly heartbeat. The show was chaos wrapped in brilliance. Carol and her core ensemble, Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, Tim Conway, and Lyle Waggoner, turned sketches into living folklore. They didn't just parody Hollywood, they humanized it. At its peak, over 30 million Americans tuned in every week. The numbers were staggering, but Carol didn't count viewers. She counted moments. The ones where laughter and silence collided. Writer's perspective. She ran that show like a symphony. Every actor had a note, every punchline a heartbeat. Still, even amid the glitter, there were cracks forming behind the curtain. The weight of being the first woman to headline and produce a variety series was immense. She was breaking ceilings that had glass and steel mixed into them. Crew member recollection. She treated every lighting guy, every cameraman like family. But some nights you could see it in her eyes, that exhaustion that no amount of applause could erase. The pressure was relentless. Deadlines, scripts, rehearsals, musical numbers, choreography, guest stars all orbiting around her. Carol was the center of gravity, and the cost of holding a universe together was invisible but heavy. And yet, her laughter remained untouched. When things went wrong, she laughed harder. When sketches failed, she rewrote them overnight. When an actor forgot lines, she ad-libbed with such grace that the audience never noticed. By the early 1970 seconds, the Carol Burnett Show had become a national institution, part comedy, part therapy, part home. It had won 25 Emmys, and Time magazine named it one of the most important hours in television history. Financially, she had become one of the highest-paid women in the industry, over $50,000 per week, in 1,970 seconds money, equivalent to more than $300,000 today. But she rarely spoke about it. She quietly donated, funded arts, scholarships, and supported young performers. It was her way of honoring the anonymous man who once gave her $2,000 in faith. The show's magic, however, wasn't in money or fame. It was in the humanity it carried. Each episode was a small act of rebellion against cynicism. Carol's comedy didn't punch down. It lifted up. She never mocked pain. She translated it. Fan letter. 197. 2 excerpt. You made me laugh the week I buried my mother. Thank you for reminding me I could. That, she said later, was the real award. The curtain rose and fell for 11 seasons, 276 episodes, and an entire generation. Through wars, scandals, and the fading golden age of television, the Carol Burnett Show endured because it wasn't just entertainment. It was empathy broadcast in Technicolor. By the time the final curtain closed in 1978, America wept. Carol wept too, not for the end of a show, but for the beginning of silence. She tugged her ear one last time, whispering to the heavens, "We did it, Nanny." She walked off stage alone, her footsteps echoing through Studio 33. Behind her, applause thundered. Ahead of her, the quiet waited. And inside that quiet, something darker began to stir, the sound of laughter fading into the weight of loss. Fame can feel like applause, endless, deafening, and sweet. But when it fades, the echo becomes a cage. For Carol Burnett, that silence began not in the tabloids, but in her own home. By the mid-1970 seconds, the Carol Burnett Show was at its peak, 30 million viewers, 25 Emmys, a cultural phenomenon that made America laugh through war and Watergate. Yet backstage, the laughter that once came easily had begun to tremble. Harvey Korman, her comedic partner and dearest collaborator, started arriving to rehearsals withdrawn, irritated, and fragile. He'd stare at the floor during table reads, sigh heavily between takes, then vanish after shooting. To the public, they were inseparable. To those behind the curtain, something had shifted. One Friday afternoon, after another tense rehearsal, Carol quietly followed him to his dressing room. She knocked. No answer. Finally, the door cracked open, just enough for him to whisper, "I'm just not happy here anymore." He closed the door. She stood there alone, surrounded by laughter echoing from another studio. That weekend, she called his agent and fired him, an act she described years later as a heartbreak disguised as professionalism. Monday morning, Harvey returned whistling. "I'm back," he said. Carol smiled, hugged him, and rehired him on the spot. On his door, she taped a brass plaque that read, "Mr. Happy-Go-Lucky." It wasn't a joke, it was forgiveness. But the strain lingered. As success grew, so did the burden. Tim Conway, the unpredictable genius of the cast, thrived on chaos. He refused to rehearse properly, insisting that true comedy lived in surprise. And he was right. His improvised sketches often left the entire cast paralyzed with laughter, the audience roaring, the cameras shaking. Still, every outburst of brilliance carried a cost. Crew members struggled to film coherent takes. Writers scrambled to stitch fragments into usable material. Carol bore the weight of keeping it all together, knowing one missed cue could unravel a week's work. Crew perspective. She was the glue, the mother of the set. If she cracked, we all would. Behind her laughter, exhaustion grew. Some nights she drove home in silence, headlights cutting through the smog of Los Angeles, tears streaking the makeup she hadn't bothered to remove. The funny woman of America was, in private, running on fumes. Then came the sketch that changed everything, The Gong Show. It began like any other parody, but when cameras rolled, something raw broke free. Carol played Eunice Higgins, a desperate middle-aged woman craving approval on a cheap TV talent show. She sang off-key, eyes wide with hope, her voice cracking with something that didn't feel like acting. When the judges mocked her, Carol didn't reach for a punchline. She simply stood there, breathing heavy, trembling. The silence in the studio was suffocating. Crew members later said they couldn't hold back tears behind the cameras. It wasn't performance, it was confession. Eunice's humiliation was Carol's own. Years of feeling invisible, unwanted, and unheard bled through that scene. When it aired, the country fell silent. Critics hailed it as genius. Carol never watched it again. Eunice's pain felt like mine, she said decades later, and I couldn't bear to see it twice. That sketch became legend, leading to Mama's Family and an avalanche of awards, but Carol saw it differently. We were supposed to help people forget their troubles, she said. That night, we reminded them. When the series finally ended in 1978, she stood alone on stage as the curtain fell, waving goodbye through tears. America thought they were tears of nostalgia. They weren't. They were the tears of a woman who had spent a decade giving everything she had and suddenly had nowhere left to give it. But tragedy, for Carol Burnett, never arrived with a headline. It arrived quietly, through the cracks of family. Her first marriage to Don Soroyan, a college sweetheart who once shared her dream, had crumbled years earlier under the weight of grief and alcoholism. But her second marriage to television producer Joe Hamilton, the man who had helped shape her show, seemed at first like stability. Together they built a blended home of 8 children, 3 of them Carol's own. On camera, they looked like the perfect team, creative equals, partners in success. Off camera, the walls told a different story. Joe's temper flared under pressure. Control became love's substitute. Carol, ever the peacemaker, spent nights mending what pride had broken. We had all the tools, she would later say, but we kept building separate houses. They separated quietly. No scandal, no statement, just 2 people standing on opposite sides of the same silence. When the divorce finalized in 1984, Carol didn't collapse. She exhaled. The world saw a star resting. In truth, she was rebuilding from ashes. Then came the heartbreak that no mother could outlive. Her eldest daughter, Carrie, began slipping into the same darkness that once consumed Carol's parents. Drugs, rebellion, the slow erosion of self. Rehab after rehab, promise after relapse. Carol endured it all with the same composure she'd once shown on stage, smiling through chaos, holding back panic. But the night Carrie vanished from a treatment facility in Texas, everything cracked. Carol searched frantically, calling hospitals, police, friends. For days, there was no word. When she was finally found alive, Carol made the most excruciating decision of her life, to have her daughter institutionalized against her will. Carrie refused to speak to her for over a year. It ripped me apart, Carol admitted in a trembling voice. But I loved her enough to let her hate me. The silence between them lasted until Carrie, 17 and newly sober, finally knocked on her mother's door and whispered, "Thank you." They rebuilt. Together they wrote Hollywood Arms, a play about Carol's hard childhood. For a moment it seemed life had come full circle until cancer struck. In 2002, at just 38 years old, Carrie died of lung cancer that spread to her brain. Carol held her hand until the end, whispering lines from their play like prayers. When the curtain fell on her daughter's life, the world seemed unbearably quiet again. Losing her was like losing a piece of my soul, she said. Yet, she still showed up. She still smiled. She still laughed when laughter felt impossible. Because for Carol Burnett, grief was not an ending. It was another act, and she refused to leave the stage before the story was done. For most people, legacy is a word carved on gravestones. For Carol Burnett, it's something living, breathing, evolving with every laugh she ever gave away. She didn't just entertain. She reshaped the architecture of American comedy. Before Carol, television variety was a man's playground ruled by names like Sid Caesar, Milton Berle, and Jackie Gleason. After Carol, it became an open stage where women could lead, write, direct, and dare to be funny without apology. Media historians note, Lucille Ball opened the door, but Carol built the house. What she created was not imitation, it was inheritance. Her influence ripples across generations. Tina Fey, Maya Rudolph, Amy Poehler, Kristen Wiig, Kate McKinnon all trace their comedic DNA back to the woman who proved laughter could be graceful and profound at once. In interviews, they describe her as the template, the North Star, the proof it could be done. Tina Fey once said, Carol Burnett didn't just make women funny. She made it possible for women to fail and still be respected. That was her true revolution, not perfection, but permission. Her 1,970-second sketches broke rules nobody even realized existed. She could make you laugh with physical absurdity, then make you cry a heartbeat later. In an era obsessed with flawless glamour, she showed that vulnerability was its own kind of power. The laughter she created didn't just echo through studios. It entered homes, hospitals, and lonely apartments. Soldiers stationed overseas wrote her letters saying her show reminded them of home. Families in mourning said her sketches gave them 1 hour of peace. Her humor wasn't escapism, it was empathy disguised as entertainment. Fan letter 1974 from Vietnam. Your show plays on a small black and white TV here every Sunday night. For 30 minutes, we forget where we are. For that, thank you. To this day, those letters remain in a small wooden box in her study folded neatly beside Mabel's old sewing thimble. Carol's style of comedy aged like music, timeless, honest, refusing to bend to cynicism. Even as culture shifted toward irony and sarcasm, her sincerity stayed luminous. She became a kind of moral compass for show business, proof that kindness and authenticity could still triumph in an industry built on illusion. Modern Critic 2023, Carol Burnett is not nostalgia. She's relevance wrapped in memory. In her laughter, America still recognizes itself. Her humanitarian legacy is quieter but just as profound. She funded dozens of scholarships for theater students, sponsored addiction recovery programs, and anonymously paid medical bills for struggling artists. Few knew the full extent of her giving until much later. When asked why she did it, she replied simply, because someone once did it for me. That invisible kindness, the echo of that first $50 and the anonymous $2,000 gift became the blueprint of her life's philosophy. Receive grace, then multiply it. Even her final creative years carried purpose. In her late 80s, she appeared in Better Call Saul as Marion, a quiet grandmother whose gentle face hid sharp intelligence, a performance that critics called hauntingly human. Then at 91, she stunned audiences again in Palm Royale. Her timing still impeccable, her presence regal. When she received a standing ovation at the 2024 Emmy Awards, she whispered backstage, I think Mabel would have smiled. In that moment, the circle closed. The little girl from a crumbling boarding house had outlasted every shadow, every doubt, every ghost. Her life had become its own kind of sermon. That laughter isn't the opposite of pain, it's the language of survival. And maybe that's why her influence endures long after the applause fades. Because Carol Burnett didn't just leave behind performances, she left behind proof that a broken beginning doesn't decide the ending. As one critic wrote, if comedy is the art of turning pain into light, then Carol Burnett was its eternal sun. There is a photograph taken sometime in the 1,960 seconds of Carol Burnett standing backstage, half lit by the glow of a single bulb. Her hair is immaculate, her dress flawless, but her eyes are elsewhere. Not on the crowd, not on the cameras somewhere far beyond them, perhaps all the way back to that little boarding house in Hollywood where a grandmother whispered, someday, sweetheart, you'll be up there too. That photograph, more than any trophy, explains her story. It's not about fame or laughter. It's about a woman who carried her past like a folded letter she never stopped reading. In every smile she gave, there was an echo of the silence she once survived. In every joke, a prayer for the brokenhearted. In every curtain call, a promise to the little girl who once pretended to have a twin so she wouldn't feel alone. She outlived nearly everyone she loved. Yet, she never turned bitter. Time, it seems, couldn't take what sorrow had already refined. Now, at 92, Carol walks slower, but she walks lighter. Her laugh has softened, but it still carries the same music. She knows that legacy isn't measured in ratings or reruns. It's measured in the warmth that lingers long after the laughter stops. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she sits in her Santa Barbara garden, a notebook beside her, the ocean breathing softly in the distance. Neighbors who pass by say she hums fragments of old songs from her show, fragments of life. If you listen closely, you might hear her whispering lines to herself, maybe for no audience at all, maybe just to keep the music alive. Because that's who she's always been, the woman who turned pain into melody and laughter into light. Carol Burnett didn't just give the world joy. She gave it a map of how to survive grief, how to stay kind, and how to keep walking when no one is watching. Some legends fade. She lingers quietly, gracefully, like the last note of a song that refuses to die. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,